Well, good evening and konnichiwa from here in New York. Josh Walker with Japan Society. Sorry for that awkward 1 minute as you were wondering where you were. You are in the right place. I want to just say welcome and thank you all for joining us for tonight's timely and important discussion on the power of cross-racial solidarity in advancing racial justice. Over the past year, we've seen an alarming rise in violence against the Asian American Pacific Islander community here in New York and across the United States. While we know that racism, harassment, and aggression against marginalized communities isn't new, the events of 2020 have brought this to the forefront and have sparked important conversations like the one we're going to have tonight. We've chosen to focus on the power of multiracial coalitions as a key structure and strategy for advancing issues of racial justice, something that we feel is critical to make further strides. We have a truly extraordinary and all-star panel of speakers that I'm truly grateful to be able to bring to you tonight. And I'm so appreciative of them for taking the time to offer their insights on this important topic. Let me first introduce our moderator and co-organizer for the evening, who will then introduce our expert speakers so I can get out of the way and we can enjoy learning together. I'm very much looking forward to learning from tonight. Dr. Maya Fisher is the founder and chief executive transformation officer of Global Equity Forward and has spent the last 20 years committed to issues of racial justice and equity as an international education expert and nonprofit leader. She has successfully developed and launched international programs for a variety of education, nonprofit, and government entities across the United States and East Asia, most notably the U.S.-Japan Council's Watanabe Scholarship and Tomodachi Initiative. In response to the racial reckoning following the murder of George Floyd and subsequent events of 2020, she founded Global Equity Forward, a strategic consulting and advisory practice focusing on equity, inclusion, and racial justice from an international perspective. She advises corporate and nonprofit clients and empowers them to implement action plans to facilitate meaningful and sustained change. Dr. Fisher holds a PhD in sociology from the University of Wisconsin-Madison and is an alumni of Williams College with a BA in psychology and sociology and New York University with an MA in international education. So with that, Dr. Fisher, Maya, welcome.
Thank you so much, Joshua, for the welcome and introduction. To add to the greetings so far, welcome everyone to this evening's discussion on the power of cross-racial solidarity and its role in advancing racial justice. I am Maya Fisher, and I will be moderating the discussion this evening. We are so excited to bring this timely content to the Japan Society's global audience. For many, this topic may be new to you. Some of you may be familiar with it. Regardless, I hope that the discussion sparks a desire within you to learn a bit more, talk a bit more about these complicated issues within your communities and with those that you care about. Before we begin, I just want to share a couple of housekeeping items for our time together tonight. This is going to be a discussion. I hope that you feel engaged with the speakers and the discussants and not only like you're just sitting here watching other people talk. So we have made the Q&A function available for you to submit any questions or comments you might have that come up as a result of the discussion. We'll be tracking them and I will do my best to integrate them into the discussion so they don't get pushed all the way to the end when inevitably we run out of time and don't really have time for Q&A. And also, we hope to be able to share a recording of this event this evening with all of you. We also may be sending a survey for tonight's event, just a short survey. And we just ask that you take a moment to share any feedback or additional comments that you might have so that we can continue providing high quality programming. So now that we have all of that out of the way, let us begin. I've had the opportunity to speak with all of our discussants, and I can't wait for them to share their insights and perspectives with the rest of you. So I'd like to begin first with introductions. Their bios are on the webpage for this event, so I don't want to take up time just repeating those. So instead, I've invited each speaker by way of introduction to answer one of the following questions. The questions are, why did you want to participate in this webinar? What do you want the audience to take away from the discussion? And or what does cross-racial solidarity mean to you? So I will start by asking Rinku Sen to kick it off.
Thank you so much. It's really wonderful to be with all of you. I'm excited to hear everyone's thoughts here and honored to throw out the first one. For me, solidarity, cross-racial solidarity really starts with being in community together. If you're not actually together, solidarity is not very possible. And we live in a really segregated country. And so if you want to be in proximity with a community that is not the one you come from or identify with, you kind of have to work at it. So I think one takeaway, if there was a takeaway from my approach to cross-racial organizing, to multiracial solidarity, it's that it starts with community and being in actual proximity to each other. And if you're not willing to do that, then political solidarity or economic solidarity or protecting each other when there are rising hate crimes are going to be really, really hard. And because of segregation, we don't always have the kind of natural organic interactions between communities that could make us, open a door to friendship or to social activity or to thinking of things to do to improve our communities together. Those other things don't become so possible. I think a great example of this is in New York City, actually, where I know a lot of our audience must be from, that the work that Asian organizations and Black organizations and Latino organizations in the city have done to make police reform possible and to win specific reforms, that built over 20 years and involved and was aided by the proximity that communities have to each other in New York City, just because we can go visit. So that's what I'll offer up. Solidarity cross-racially starts with being in community cross-racially.
Great. Thank you so much, Rinku. And just a clarifying question. When you say proximity, you're talking about physical proximity explicitly?
Yes, I'm talking about being able to be in the same restaurants, movie theaters, community centers, neighborhoods, malls, like that. Great. As well as workplaces.
Awesome. Thank you so much. And then I will turn it over to Bo. Dwayne.
Hi, good evening, everybody. So really pleased to be here with everybody and to just offer a bit of insights. And I think Rinku has, provided so much good context and a response that I myself align with as well. So I came here to this country as a refugee child. And when my family came, we were resettled on the south side of Chicago, where it was predominantly African-American neighbors. And so we didn't have any context for that, right? Because we were escaping war from Southeast Asia. And so all we knew was that it was safer than where we were. But we didn't realize that what we had settled into was a neighborhood that was historically really African-American, and it is also had continued to be where the African-American communities lived. And as children, you just naturally kind of build relationships, right? You don't think about these theoretical frameworks. You are just in relationships with each other. And so really at the crux of that is really, I think, what Rinku talked about, which is that in order for us to be in practice of solidarity, we have to be in relationships with each other, and that it's not just through a process of learning about each other, but that we have to have these opportunities to be able to both have relationships, to learn to be with each other, and to be able to kind of speak our truth, right? And I think, of course, over time, education and those opportunities where our communities are talked about intentionally or not, also contribute to that ability. But I would agree that really, I always want to be talking with folks about what solidarity means and how we actually live it in practice, because to me, that is really important. And I have so much hope because I do think that the idea of America is great, right? That all of us from all over the world could actually come here and build a more thriving culture for all of us. And that really takes both bringing the best of who we are, but also being able to struggle and recreate that which doesn't yet exist. And so that process in itself is a part of the practice of solidarity. So I look forward to the conversation, and we'll talk more.
Great. Thank you so much, Bo. Don, you have anything to add?
Yeah, well, I wanted to jump at this opportunity to be on the panel with Maya, Bo, Rinku, Taryn, and Joshua, people I really admire and have been wanting to connect more with over the years. And here we are talking about a set of subjects that I'm very passionate about, and to a great audience with the Japan Society membership. So I am very delighted to be here. In terms of takeaways, one of my core beliefs as an Asian American person here in the United States is in multiracial solidarity. This is something I've believed in ever since I was a young person coming up in the world. I've always regarded AAPIs as a coalition, and we are identified that way, whether we like it or not. And sometimes, it's a really odd thing because, I look at Asia as the side of a planet rather than, a region of the world. It's really a gigantic, part of, it's a huge part of the world. But here in the United States, of course, we are 6 or 7%, give or take, of the population. And so, we've always been identified as a coalition, and AAPIs are not particularly well resourced in the US, and therefore not as organized as we should be to have a voice, to have cultural expression, to be able to really show ourselves and be ourselves in the many identities that we are. And that's something that I think is a shortcoming for us that we need to overcome. I also think that solidarity, cross-racial solidarity, is so important because we all have common interests with other communities in the US, with Latinx people, with folks, other immigrants and refugees, with Black Americans. I'll just give you a couple examples. We share common interests in immigration policy and the path to citizenship and humane treatment of people. We share common interests in policies and practices and cultural work that combats racism, discrimination, and exclusion. We share common interest with others over issues of language access to public services and participation in our democracy. And one of my favorite recent examples is a study that recently came out on voting rights. It turns out that AAPIs are made most use of early voting. So we share an interest in early voting and other forms of access to the franchise. So those are just a few examples, but I think we have so many common interests. It's really imperative for us to build up that solidarity and make the coalition building real so that we can exercise our voice and power in our democracy.
Wow, very powerful, and some great examples of contemporary collaborations and solidarity movements. I definitely want to come back to a couple of things you mentioned, but I want to make sure that I give Taryn an opportunity to introduce herself.
Thank you so much. I'm also really thrilled and honored to be part of this evening. And I wanted to introduce myself as a Sansei descendant of survivors of the Tule Lake, Jerome, and Roar camps, and also as someone who's been very privileged to lead a foundation that supports the grassroots movement for immigrant justice, and does so in the context of contributing to a multiracial democracy where all people can live lives of freedom and dignity and safety. And then I wanted to give you an example of how these two, my personal background and my work, came together. Suru for Solidarity is a nonviolent direct action project of Japanese American social justice advocates who are working to end immigration detention right now in the United States. And they were created by survivors of the internment in the United States who wanted to say, when they saw the family separation and increased detention of immigrant children and families, never again is now. And so they did so by building solidarity with immigrant communities who are protesting immigration detention, and also with other communities that have historically or are currently suffering from family separation. So African-American descendants of slaves, communities of all backgrounds who are impacted by over-incarceration, Native American communities whose families had been separated by the state, and Holocaust survivors. So I just wanted to share that as one example of my worlds coming together, and I'm really excited to be part of tonight's conversation.
Great, thank you so much. It's interesting, between the five of us and hearing sort of how the idea of cross-racial solidarity resonates with each of you illustrates the complexity, right? We all come to it from different ways and perspectives. And Don, I love the example of you talking about using the AAPI community as just an example. Different cultures, different histories, different sets of relations between groups. That's not always easy to overcome. And there are a lot of challenges, but each of you has also illustrated examples of successfully sort of overcoming those challenges. And maybe I can go back to you, Don, and just sort of ask about, what makes those types of collaborations successful in your role, in your leadership roles? How have you seen or thinking about in what ways have you seen skills or examples of these collaborations overcoming those? How do they do it? How have you seen them do that successfully?
Well, I think that one of the foundational aspects of strong coalition building, in my experience, is relationship building. Relationships form those personal bonds. It also, it enables us to really understand and listen to our fellow, humans, just what their concerns are, what their interests are, so that we can try to work together and find those common interests. A few examples that I rattled off earlier. So relationships are absolutely critical. And I think some of the coalitions that I've seen grow in power, whether it's regional coalitions of organizers at the community level, trying to organize power up to the city level and the metropolitan level to the state, or if it's a cohort of people by a demographic like AAPIs across the country, the ones that I've seen be very successful have been really single-minded in developing those relationships so that you can build trust among coalition members to stay together. The worst examples that I've seen have been coalitions that have been coalitions in name only, where for example, one coalition member might negotiate a side deal and peel off from the rest, because they got what they wanted. And so those are, I think, some lessons that I've gained. And I think in multiracial coalition building, one really key aspect is to recognize this broader context, the racial history that we have in the US, the systems of oppression that affect different people differently, bringing that knowledge and awareness into like the kind of analysis of the power dynamics involved. I think that's really, critical. Otherwise, you'll have a lot of folks who are just trying to build coalitions without having that deep context for how to make it work and how things will be really meaningful and dependable for folks who might want to work together.
Yeah, the history and context is really important. And I see Rinku shaking her head. I know you have some thoughts about, what is needed for successful coalition building.
Yeah, that was a great lead in from Dawn. I have noted that there are a couple of qualities that I see in the leaders of the most successful efforts, whether that is a very explicitly political effort to win an election or is a mutual aid effort to, I don't know, get all the neighborhood kids into a soccer camp or whatever they need, fighting for parks for the community. So two qualities I see in the leaders who seem to have very effective relationships is curiosity and humility. So they genuinely want to know things about each other's organizations, about each other's communities. They'll put the time in and the work in to learn those things that they need to know. And then they're humble with each other about assuming that I know what your community needs to do. And through a combination of curious humility, maybe, or through a practice of curious humility or humble curiosity, they start to unearth the things that they could work on together that they have in common. And one last thing I'll say here is that I believe the most successful long-term efforts are built around, or they come up around building things, not just dismantling things. There's a lot of talk in our world right now about how to be a good ally, how to show solidarity, how to act in solidarity. And a common phrase in a lot of that language and discourse is dismantle. You have to, if you're a real ally, you're going to help dismantle structural racism and the systems of discrimination and dismantle. But I think the most successful combinations of people, cross-racial communities, are building things. They're creating an urban farm. They're creating a set of activities that enable survivors of domestic abuse to escape and rebuild their lives. They're building a better civic engagement system. They're building ways for people to vote and get access to the franchises, as Dawn said. So I think a building orientation is actually important for the sustainability and long-term possibilities of these coalitions, alliances, organizations. I'll just drop another quick example since we're collecting them here. One of my most inspiring organizations is something called Freedom Inc. that operates in Madison, Wisconsin. It is an organization of Black and Southeast Asian community members around Madison. They have a queer justice campaign, they have a freedom from violence campaign, and they're explicitly about the liberation of all of these communities. And they have a food pantry, so they're providing mutual aid to each other, and they're working to exercise the collective political power of these communities, and they seem to be in it for the long haul in the same organization. So curiosity, humility, and building are the words I have for this right now.
Wow. Yay for representation from Wisconsin. That's where I went to school. So I'm always excited to hear about good things happening there. Wow, curiosity, humility, and a building orientation. It does force you to sort of rethink and reframe some of these things. A common thread that all of you mentioned was this idea of relationship or relationship building. And like any relationship, relationships are last over time, right? So there's a time dimension to it. So you're talking about sustainability or lasting coalitions, but also relationships don't always go smoothly, right? They're not always smooth sailing. Sometimes there is history. So Don, when you were talking about context, right? So the history of relationships between these particular groups are important. Even if you're just talking within the AAPI community, if you're talking about between other marginalized groups, there's tensions, right? So just for an example, we hear a lot about the Asian American, broadly defined group in solidarity with Black Americans during the Civil Rights Movement, right? So that's usually an example of cross-racial solidarity. They had a shared mutual interest in fighting for civil rights for everybody, also in some ways challenging imperialism in different regions of the world. And so there was a shared idea and vision, right? But after civil rights, there developed and emerged some tensions intentionally created between these groups by outsiders to pit them against each other. Right. And so now, since the 90s, the 80s, there have been tensions between sort of Black American groups and Asian American groups. And so then it begs the question, how can organizations or which are comprised of individuals, overcome that kind of history, those kinds of tensions? Right? It's not ignoring it or forgetting it, but how do you sort of hold and acknowledge those historical tensions, but find a way to move forward into a shared vision on a particular other issue? Does anybody have any thoughts? I see, Don, you're shaking your head. Did you have anything to add?
No, I'm just agreeing with you, but I thought I see others shaking their heads too.
Yeah, Bo or Taryn? Oh, Bo, great.
Yeah, I'm happy to chime in a little bit because I see it every day, right? I'm on the ground here in Minneapolis working with communities who are responding in real time to everything that is happening and leading an organization that has to both respond to crisis and at the same time have ambitions for, a different kind of future. Because that's what everyone is talking about when they're talking about dismantling, is they want something else that is more equitable and representative and things like that. And so I would just say that part of the we've all talked about it, which is really what is the practice of solidarity, right? That solidarity are not just visions and they're not just aspirations, but we actually have to learn how to do solidarity. And so it starts with relationships, but the practice itself has to also embrace that process of struggle with each other, right? So both acknowledging the story of place, we all may have had many different journeys, as people say, but we're kind of in the same boat now. And so, but how do we really hear that truth and to understand that racism may look different for different communities, even if systemically it is the same sets of policies, right? But it may impact each community differently. And to take the time to learn that truth sometimes is hard because on the day-to-day, people are in crisis, right? So when you don't have a home over your head, when you don't have food to eat, it's hard to say, well, you have to learn about Asian American history, right? And so, but what we start to figure out is, well, that history should have been embedded in our education, right? So now we have young people who are fighting for their own education, right? To say, and I know this, and I think all of us went through education, or certainly K-12, without ever having to learn about anyone that looked like us, right? Let alone that history. And now our kids are fighting to make sure that they have Asian American history or ethnic studies, whatever you want to call it. And that is, really foundational, but also the practice of that is that when you have multiple truths and you come together and you're trying to create a shared future, that process is both about being from that place of curiosity, but allowing for struggle. We worked on a policy here on data disaggregation, and I think while that was understandable and people were supportive, ultimately we had, the Native Indigenous community who came to us and said, we can support, we can't support it in the policy because it impacts us in this way, but we know why you need it, right? Because Asian Americans are complex, but for us, if we identify anything other than Indian, it's going to impact our Indian education funding. It's going to impact, so we really had to go through a process of having conversations where they said, we won't stand in the way of the policy. So then we had to dig deeper and say, well, where is that? Where do we need to fix that policy? Because people want to see their complexities represented, right? And things like that. So I really do think that in addition to sort of just the ambitions that we have, part of it is there are short and long-term gains that we want to make, and being able to do that really in a real way, right, requires our acceptance of what it takes to actually be able to struggle with each other without severing the relationships, because our collective well-being is in our ability to see each other, not just our humanities, but to want the same things for every community, right?
Right, and positioning it as such, it's not a zero-sum game, right? My gains don't necessarily have to mean, a subtraction for you. So again, it's reimagining ways of looking at the world. And it's very interesting, Bo, that you mentioned education and policy, because we actually have a question from one of the attendees around the idea of, wishing we could teach examples of solidarity and looking at historical examples of cross-racial solidarity that affect policy, right? And how those potentially, I'm going to add my piece in here, I think looking at those things provide an entry point, right, for some of these difficult conversations. You can talk about the needs of different groups, but in how they work out coming together to advance things for each other or together. And so Ramona Hando Baema, I'm sorry if I mispronounced your name, but her question is, is it worthwhile looking at historical examples of cross-racial solidarity as it affects policy? And she specifically is thinking about the Chicano and AAPI farm workers in California. Oh, lots of shaking of heads. Yes, this is a good example, right? And she adds the comment that, she wishes they could teach this in schools. I guess this is a follow-up question from that. What do you think these examples, historical examples that affect policy, can do for us now? What can they provide for? What can they sort of open in the present? Anyone?
Well, I would just say I'm in full support of that, and it's important to do that because I think we often assume that there wasn't cross-racial solidarity throughout history, right?
Yeah.
And so to be able to have examples means that people can see that our communities do know how to work with each other and have worked with each other for those kinds of wins, and that's important. So I would just echo that sentiment of the participant who said and say, yes, we should do more of that. And then also to acknowledge that over time, there has not been enough, and there has been more invested in our being fragile than in our being strong. And so that means that our starting place is also that not only do we not have enough examples, but also our ability in terms of time, resources, infrastructure. There is a starting point that's you know, where all the muscles might not be there, right? So we can acknowledge that we are starting from a place where people have been kept only focused on their own communities for survival, right? I'm talking to people who on a daily basis are facing eviction, who are, you know, facing, you know, the inability to access healthcare. And so to tell them they have to be in solidarity, they may not even be thinking about that because they're like in crisis, right? But it doesn't mean that those of us who are privileged to be leading organizations should not invest in that and to build that up, because that is our best chance at being able to make sure that, as Senator Paul Wellstone used to say, we all do better when we do better, right? So there is truth to that, but we can learn so much from history, the history that hasn't been taught to us about how others have done it, even with less resources than we have now, right?
Great. Rinku, I saw that you had wanted to chime in as well.
Yeah, I think history is really, really important. What I do at Narrative Initiative, or what we do as a team, is think about how to change the big stories that we tell ourselves about the country, about our communities, about individual people of who have different characteristics. And so I have a lot of experience with the reaction that people have when they hear a piece of history that they didn't know. And I do think that the dominant picture of US history is of racial strife and racial conflict. You know, if it's not between Black and white over the enslavement of Black people, then it's between Asian and white over jobs in the 1970s. That's outsourcing, and as the economy began to globalize. And I think there are actually probably just as many stories of communities working together, socializing together, different kinds of people being in community together, but they have been written out of our textbooks and out of our children's textbooks. So just to address this person's question slightly at a practical level, whether or not we can teach these things in schools, and I think it's worth fighting for them to be taught in schools. Like, you know, take a look at what your kids' social studies curriculum is right now, and talk to their teacher about including this. That's a piece of advocacy that all of us can do. If you do it in a group of people, you might actually succeed. They might have to listen to you harder than if you go in on your own. So I think a really practical thing for all of us to do, because you can do it in an elevator or at the bar or at the dinner table, is have 3 or 4 stories of historic community building and social change making together. And just memorize them. It's a really practical, like, I'm gonna learn 3 stories and I'm gonna bring those stories up every time anybody talks to me about Black Asian things or Latino Asian things or Asian and anybody else things. And I think we have to find community ways of delivering those stories. So the easiest way is we all learn a few and we start sharing them with our friends and family and community members. But maybe we need to think about what kind of education happens outside of schools, what's happening in community centers, what's happening in libraries. If there are members of library boards on this call, there's a ton that libraries are doing and can do. And librarians may end up saving us all, frankly, from our own ignorance and credulity. So One other story I'll throw in here is in 1950, the federal government tried to pass a law called the Emergency Detention Act. So they would have been able to detain anybody for that they suspected of being ready to cause an emergency, and Black people fought it, were not winning, and then recruited the JACL, the Japanese American Citizens League, to get involved, and together they had enough power to prevent it from happening. Now that obviously falls more in the dismantle category than the build category, but it was going to be hard to build anything if that law had passed. So, I actually just learned that example today, and I'm going to add it to my roster of stories.
Great, thank you so much. So we have sort of talked around trying to sort of look at the dimensions of cross-racial solidarity. And one of the reasons that we put this panel together was around the issues of increased visibility in violence against Asian Americans, and about speaking to Rinku's point also about the narratives, right? Changing the story and the stories around why the violence happens and how organizations and individuals are responding to it, emerged this discourse around cross-racial solidarity as a way to respond, to deal with this, to fight this. And so that's sort of one of the motivations for creating the event. In this moment, there's some uniqueness about this moment, right? This particular, 2020 as a year, a lot of sort of original, unique things happen. And so I think, Taryn, if I can turn to you, what do you see that's unique about this moment that lends itself to these kinds of cross-racial and multiracial framings for advancing justice?
This increase, the current increase in violence and discrimination against Asian Americans, is occurring at a time when there is a racial reckoning in the United States. There is a persistent demand by communities of all backgrounds for a reckoning with the historic injustices of this country and the present day injustices. And I think that I think it's really critical to respond to the vulnerabilities, needs of Asian and Pacific Islander communities in solidarity and in support with others at the same time. And I did have, and to look at, what are the deeper causes, not just respond to violence, but what are the underlying problems? And there is an example that one of my colleagues just shared with me yesterday in California of $150 million API equity budget. I don't know if folks are already familiar with that, but it is a holistic approach to advancing racial justice by investing in and centering the impacted communities that I think was made possible by years of investment in leadership and civic engagement of API communities. And just a few examples of what the API equity budget will do is that it will invest 10 million in anti-bias block grants to provide fundings to schools, which is something that we've been talking about, to pilot restorative justice programs to address hate and racialized bullying, and 110 million for community-based organizations to provide violence prevention and victim services, and 5 million for a peer social media network project to address online and mental health challenges facing children and youth, 10 million for disaggregation and accuracy of data collection, and to promote data equity and documenting API needs and challenges. So I just wanted to share that as an example of the kind of approach that happens when there's organizing and solidarity and power building and partnership.
Great. And that fund, is that from the state of California or is that private?
It's the state of California. State of California.
Wow.
And I think that private philanthropy has been investing in multiracial coalitions, in API communities, and the diversity across the state of API communities, and electing folks to office and holding them accountable. And so I think this is an example of that.
Yeah, this is a result of that long-term investment. Yeah, Don?
Yeah, and I'll add to this. I think it's heartening to see more examples of, various entities stepping up with funding for the types of important things that Taryn is mentioning. I think it's also important, your question, Maya, was about the unique aspects of this streak of violence. And to Rinku's earlier point, a huge part of what we're up against in addressing violence and harassment and exclusion and discrimination is the huge amount of disinformation and misinformation that's being spread around, on this topic. I mean, there's a lot of disinformation, misinformation about many topics, but in this one in particular, we see a handful of viral videos, really taking off and giving people the impression that Black people have been perpetrators of anti-Asian violence. There have been a couple of these videos, but what we have found is that, if you look at some of the research that's been done, the majority of people committing these acts of violence, exclusion, harassment have been white males in the United States, goaded on by Republican politicians who've been scapegoating Asian Americans since the pandemic began. There's a University of Michigan study, which is probably the best known of the studies out there, that did a systematic analysis of all the news reports that have been out there, since the pandemic began in 2020, and just scoured all the records to see if there was any mention of who was perpetrating, and the vast majority are being perpetrated by white males. So there's like a huge disconnect. And a lot, and this is not to say, we have to, immediately start pointing fingers, but I think it does get to some of these questions about root causes, like what generates these narratives that we're all trying to combat, that the types that Rinku is addressing in the work that she does with the Narrative Initiative. How do we get to those kind of big stories that we tell ourselves as Americans to explain things? And how can we try to combat misinformation out there, some of it purposefully spread, to get us to think a certain way and then to actively divide us? And to me, that's a real challenge for us to try to overcome.
Yeah, the information and misinformation, I'll say, is an interesting one. And actually the point that you brought up, Don, in terms of the research, right? There are conversations, and actually one of our advanced questions raised this issue about the disconnect between, sort of what one narrative that does say what you're talking about, which is, perpetrators of all these non-white categories, but research that says, 74% are white and male perpetrators, right? So part of it is, interrogating the research, right? What is the source of the information, right? I think one of the bigger questions too is, how are they counting these incidents, right? What is it explicitly that they're counting? And part of it too is, just because, if it isn't the case that 74% are white male, okay, but that still means we have to have a conversation about the 24% that are non-white. And that's often a conversation that people don't want to have, right? We don't want to talk about our own community's anti-Asian sentiment or anti-Black sentiment within our own marginalized communities, right? That's a hard question. We can, ostracize, marginalize other groups in an effort to advance our standing. But we don't like to talk about that, right? Because that's a hard conversation to have. But I do believe it is part of this larger conversation about information. What are the data telling you? And what are the conversations that we need to have, right? And so one of my follow-up questions is, we're getting all this attention and time, which is great, but what is missing? What are the things that we do need to elevate, that we do need to have part of this conversation? And I know a couple of you had some thoughts about that. I think Rinku or Taryn, or even coming back to Don, if you want as well.
I'm happy to go and say a couple of things. One thing about the last question is that, I think the data on hate crimes is going to vary from place to place. In New York City, people live much more tightly packed in, and it's a very segregated city. So white people don't live so much where Asians, Black, and Latino, and I would include Arab and Middle Eastern communities are concentrated. It's not like you can never find a white person in Jamaica, Queens, but you're going to find a lot of Asians and Black people and Latinos there. So from locale to locale, the data could change because it's about who is in proximity in a negative way to each other. I think what people said about hate crimes by non-white people that I still think is true is that the vilification of Asians is a white supremacist thing. It comes out of white supremacy. And I think actually one thing that's missing in our discussion that I hope we can change is that we don't talk enough, we do talk some about how the model minority image came to be. It was 150 years of hatred, exclusion, violence against Asian people, and then 50 years of this really dramatic turnaround that starts at the point that the US government is in a bunch of wars in Asia and has to prove that these are not racist wars, they are necessary wars. And we love Asians because they're our model minority. I can draw that thread. And I think we could do a lot more deconstructing of that image and that mythology and of its effect on all communities of color and on white communities too. So that's a missing part of the discussion that I think would be really good to dig into a little bit. What is the image of all these communities? How did those images get developed and spread and adopted? And what would be a more accurate way of seeing each other and ourselves?
And to your point that you mentioned, it's also, I think it's really important when we talk about cross-racial solidarity, we often talk only about marginalized communities working with each other, and we're missing a whole section of the population, which are white majority people as well, right? Like they can be and should be part of these coalitions and conversations. There are people who want to support, who want to figure out, who want to know what they can do. And I think sometimes we sort of have blinders on and sort of miss out on, the people who are actually operating within the system that we are trying to, in some ways, dismantle, but also trying to rebuild in more equitable ways. And so I think it's important what you're talking about, Rinku, in terms of thinking about the narrative, the conversation, who we are talking about, who we are including, and being intentional about what we're talking about. And to the previous point of, if we argue that sort of white supremacy as a framework is the problem, not white people, but the framework that operates across all groups. White supremacy operates within the Black community, within the Asian American community as well. And so, we have to look at the system and try to find ways to bring, all the different groups who are oppressed by the system in different ways, as you mentioned earlier, Don, but try to bring us all together to try to figure out a way to create a system that, works for all of us, or at least doesn't hurt all of us, if that makes any sense. All right, so I'm looking at the time and I can't believe the hour has basically gone by. But I will close with a question to all of you and to the audience too. We hope people leave today inspired to learn and act, right? And so some of you are on the philanthropy side, some of you are on the ground floor side, and some of you are on both. And so when you think about cross-racial solidarity for the long term, not being a reaction to a current crisis, right, but an intentional collaboration in advancing social justice or racial justice writ large, what advice do you have to organizations or communities about how to invite or welcome people and partners into these efforts with intention and authenticity?
Yeah, I'm happy to begin the last round. So I want to build on a point that Rinku mentioned earlier about building. I think building is so important, in the work that I've done over the years. We often talk about grievance to governance, and really trying to build something, that can really serve us better. And so to reflect on the model minority comments that she made earlier, if you look at the model minority literature from the 1960s, and there's it spans a couple decades, one of the implied messages is that AAPIs, Asian Americans, are model because we don't shake things up too much. We don't rock the boat. We don't cause trouble. And as we think about building, the thing that is beautiful to me is the opportunity to cause good trouble, to build towards political power and voice, while we're, dealing with these big narratives that try to, kind of pigeonhole us as quarreling factions in America. I would love for us to champion and advance a new narrative about solidarity and coalition building. Look at the voting rights experiences that we had in the last election cycle, and it even predates that, but it wasn't covered as much in the media. And so many more examples of that cross-racial solidarity building, with AAPIs, between other racial groups in the US. And to me, that's something really worth building towards, and something that we can really latch onto when we try to welcome people into some collective action.
Great, thank you so much. Anyone else would like to add a final thought? Bo?
Sure, I'll just chime in and say that I think the work that we have to do also is really to move away from just thinking about race as the only frame in which we talk about our people, right, in our communities. And so it's not race or, it's race and. And that is really important for this work, so that, when we talk about racial justice, it's in the construct of what else has to happen, right? And things like that, because I really believe that in our communities, we also come with so much assets about how we have taken care of each other in our communities. And that is something that we can also lift up, and that collective care is a form of resilience. And so how do we make sure that when we talk about all of these things, we're not just looking at people in communities one-dimensionally and then trying to solve problems one-dimensionally, right? Like that is never going to work. And so I hope that if we do that, then we really invite people to really talk about all the things that we need to do to ensure that people have the ability to take care of themselves and their loved ones and be a part of communities that are truly thriving for everyone. So.
Yeah, I mean, we all come to these things in our complexity, right? Our communities are complex, we are complex. Nobody likes to be pigeonholed as one thing, right? And so solutions and actions need to be multifaceted, just like the human beings that are part of these communities are, right? Rinku, would you have?
Yeah, thank you. I'm going to take the opportunity to answer a question I saw in the Q&A about how you move these things forward if you're in a place that's not as urban and well-resourced for organizing as New York City is. And it's a pretty simple answer. Try to get some people together to talk, just to talk and learn from each other, share perspectives on what is happening in your town or city. And you might find some resources at this organization, Not in Our Town, which helps people in towns and cities around the country take action against hate crimes, whatever actions turn out to make sense for that community. So if there isn't a lot of like community organizing or funding or, I don't know, political groups in your wherever you are, try to just get some people together who are willing to talk.
Good advice. It's got to start somewhere, definitely. Taryn, did you have any final thoughts?
Yeah, I think to just follow on what Rinku said, everyone in our organization was trained in a process called deep canvassing, which is really listening with curiosity and humility, and then sharing stories of vulnerability in order to build a relationship. And during the pandemic, it was done on phone. It's also done in person, but it's just a method of organizing that was developed in small towns and less populated areas where groups of people get to know each other and build relationship that way. And so there's a Deep Canvas Institute, and you could learn it online. And I think I also wanted to say that Bo, she's so humble, right? But I really have looked to her work in Minneapolis for inspiration over the past year and a half. And she's a senior strategist for something called the Shared Liberation Network, a place where community leaders can learn from each other's experience in building multiracial solidarity. And so I just wanted to lift that up. And I think, I don't know, to me, it all kind of comes down to really getting to the point where you believe that your well-being, your safety, your liberation is really bound up with everybody else's, that we don't get to the promised land until everybody gets to the promised land. And that's developing that empathy.
Thank you so much. And so with that, I just want to thank all of our speakers and discussants for this evening. I just really appreciate your time and willingness to be part of these discussions. I know it's not easy, but this is where we start to make progress and share information. And to all of you who joined us this evening, thank you for spending an hour learning and talking with us. I hope we got to some of your questions. We got more questions than we anticipated, so we tried to get in as many as we could. And I do hope this is just the beginning of the conversations to come. On behalf of the Japan Society and Global Equity Forward, I wish you a safe and relaxing evening, or if you're in Japan, the start of your day. Thank you so much for joining us, and we hope to see you at a future event.